Hello, Melissa.
Hello, Jean.
So happy that you give us this opportunity for the interview.
No, my pleasure.
So delighted.
Yes.
So we have a few questions, and we'll go one by one.
Okay.
So the question one is about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In your essay, Whiteness, you said as a teenager, you were only dimly aware of your Aboriginality. Because of the whiteness you were privileged to enjoy, courtesy to your relatively pale skin and hidden family history. So this pale skin obviously comes from your father, who claimed to be a son of a Ukraine farmer or white Russian or middle-class Czech refugee, depending on who asked the question at the time. As you said in another essay, which I read and quite interesting, not quite white in the head. Only until you were 14 did your mother confess that you were Aboriginal. By then, the government stopped removing Aboriginal babies in Queensland. So at 20, you learned that your father, Wally Lucas, had been born Vladimir Lucashenko. Can you tell us about your own journey of discovering your identity and the place where you grew up?
Yes. Well, I grew up in Brisbane, which is Australia's third largest city, and I'm one of 7 children. I have 6 older brothers, and it was because I was the youngest that I was unaware of my Aboriginality. My oldest brother is clearly Aboriginal looking, but he left the family young, and so while my other brothers knew that we were of Aboriginal, I was too young to have known Jonathan. And I just grew up thinking that some people had pale white skin and other people had olive skin and curly brown hair. And that was an era in Queensland where race was never ever talked about except when people wanted to be racist. It was considered impolite in society to talk about anyone's race at all. So, and it's actually not accurate to say that Aboriginal children stopped being removed in the 1970s. I know I wrote that and it's on my website, but the form of child removal has changed. Aboriginal children are still being removed from Aboriginal families that are capable of caring for them and want to care for them. And so the policy of assimilation into white Australia is still going on today, very much so, but in a disguised form. But yeah, I grew up with my family. We grew most of our own food on a small acreage on the outskirts of the city. And I went to school with ordinary Australian kids, public education, in both primary and secondary school. Then I left school when I was 16 and I did a few blue collar jobs, and then people kept telling me I should go to university, so I applied and I got in. I had no idea what university would do, but it absolutely changed my life, and it's the best decision I ever made. That was in the era when university education was free in Australia. So I studied public policy and economics. I went to university thinking I wanted to become a small businesswoman, and I came out the other end interested in politics and philosophy, sociology and literature.
Was it rare in those days that Aboriginal children go to university?
I'm 53 and I'm in my cohort. I was among the first cohort of Aboriginal people beginning to go to university as an ordinary thing. It wasn't as common as it is today, but I was at university with probably 30 other Aboriginal students at the university at the time, and that was really important, formative years for me to meet Aboriginal people and just to learn from them, and some of those relationships have persisted today, and I've been adopted into one of those Aboriginal families of one of my peers at the university.
Can you tell us, were you shocked when you were told that you were actually Aboriginal?
Yeah, I was. Because until that point, I had this idea of us as basically Australian, but with this Russian heritage. And but as soon as Mum said it, I went, oh, that's why our skin is olive. That's why we've all got brown eyes, except for one brother. That's why we look different. And I always had a sense of being different growing up, very much so. That could have come from either side of the family. But at school, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls were definitely the queen bees, and I was a strange child and so far from being a queen bee that it's not funny. And I never know whether that sense of being an outsider at school was from Mum's Aboriginality or from Dad being Russian or a mix of the two or something else altogether.
Did that discovery impact on your sense of identity?
It took a while. At that age, I was practicing karate. I was a karateka for 10 years and Queensland champion, met several times, and a black belt when I was 18, I think it was. And so at 14, my focus was very much on karate, and that was a kind of substitute identity. I wasn't interested in race, so I was kind of neutral about it. But I do remember talking to one of the few other Aboriginal kids at my high school, Rory O'Connor, not long after Mum told me, though, and we discussed it and worked out that we were, the same degree of Aboriginal, and I don't think I knew until then that Rory was Aboriginal either. And we've also got a long term, lifelong relationship because our families were neighbours and our brothers are very close. And it's funny how things. Our brothers are extremely close, like brothers, and I think that's not a coincidence either. I've noticed in several families how Aboriginal kids will gravitate, fair-skinned Aboriginal kids will gravitate to other Aboriginal kids, whether they know they're Aboriginal or not, just because of the simpatico.
It's kind of intuitively.
Yeah, intuitive and small things, body language and I guess like calls to like.
Can we say that the discovery put you closer to Aboriginal values or, lifestyle or the world?
It sharpened my interest. I think I grew up with Aboriginal values, even though the fact of Aboriginality was hidden. The values I grew up with were very strongly egalitarian, very strongly connected to nature and being taught little things like you never take all of the berries off one plant, you always leave some to regenerate, and you share what you've got unstintingly, things like that. So the values persisted even though the fact of my Aboriginality wasn't known to me. Yeah.
So that reflects the place where you grew up. Is it very much Aboriginal community?
Not really. The only other Aboriginal family close by was the one that I said about they're like brothers, my brother. No, mostly all mixed, white Australian, some small percentage Asian, European immigrant, quite a few immigrants, some Italian families, but basically just an ordinary Australian setting.
So it's quite diverse.
It was
not
diverse.
Exclusively Aboriginal community.
Oh no, definitely not. No.
That's really interesting because of the book, the story you describe. Very.
Yes. Well, see, my identity journey now. I still live in a part of Brisbane where it's predominantly white, some Asian, some mixed, South African, Mediterranean, all different ethnicities, but it's not majority Aboriginal. But my identity has deepened and strengthened very much in 30 years since I found out. So I know where all the Aboriginal families near me are, and they know where I am, and the network of Aboriginal people across Brisbane, it's like a virtual community.
How about your father's side? Has much impact on your upbringing or on your This is the system of values.
I'm sure the answer is yes, because I grew up with my father. And so, yes, the influence is definitely there. But interestingly, at the same time, my father, as I said to you earlier, was racially abused as a young man, called a stupid wop and all this kind of stuff. All his life did working class jobs. He cut sugarcane, he worked in a gold mine in Tennant Creek, he was a labourer, but a very smart man, but very physically very strong. And he associated with people, mostly ordinary white Australians, and his Russian family. And he assimilated into Australian mainstream. He had two selves. He had his Russian self and he had his dinky-die Aussie self. So when he spoke English, he spoke very mainstream English, but of course he spoke Russian as well. So he was an interesting man, but see, he worked in the bush a lot and he had some exposure to bush culture and a little bit to Aboriginal culture as well. So it's kind of all mixed up.
Do you feel like you know your father very well?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think I'm still learning to understand him, even though he died in 2010. I wrote a poem for his funeral and I said something like Australian name, Australian home, but Russian blood and Russian bone.
Did he often talk about himself or his past or his own family back in Russia?
Well, his parents came to Brisbane. He never spoke about his father ever, and I only met his father once in my life. I knew his mother, and she lives in Melbourne. That part of the family lives in Melbourne. He didn't talk much about the Russian stuff. It was just who he was. He talked about different funny stories from life generally and just everyday conversation. But he had a lot of pain. He spent part of his childhood in an orphanage. His mother left the father because he was so violent, and she had to put my father and his brother in an orphanage for a year to escape. And then she went back and got them. I'm sure he was terribly brutalised in the orphanage as well as at home. So, yeah, he had a lot to forget.
Is that bit reflected in your writing?
Yes.
And about your writing, and in the online introduction says Melissa Lucashenko is a acclaimed Aboriginal writer of Guru and European heritage. And in one of the interviews you gave, you said that when you first started writing, there was still a glaring hole in Australian literature, with very few Aboriginal fiction writers published. And of course, that is not the case anymore. And you also said being Aboriginal is about the culture and family links, not just about the biology, which we touched on.
Yes.
And however, Aboriginal means something different to others, to outsiders.
Yes.
Usually something much more restricted and restrictive,
yes,
as you noted. How do you define Aboriginal writing and Aboriginal Australian writer?
Well, an Aboriginal Australian writer is someone of Aboriginal heritage who thinks of themselves as an Aboriginal person and has a relationship with an Aboriginal community that accepts them as Aboriginal. As far as what Aboriginal writing is, I think I would take the broad definition and say it's any writing by an Aboriginal author.
Why do you say that, to outsiders, Aboriginal often is something restricted and restrictive?
Because of 2 centuries of colonisation and racism. I mean, Australia's only just at the very beginning of understanding that we had a complex and valuable civilisation here and lived sustainably forever in a country that they've managed to almost ruin in 200 years. Because Aboriginal people are not always seen as part of the Homo sapiens. We're seen as some kind of precursor, and of course overseas audiences don't have good information either.
No.
There's been an apartheid, a intellectual and often a physical apartheid in Australia until very, very recently, and so who we are is still a mystery to most of the world.
That is also one of the reasons I really want to introduce you and to your book to
Yes.
Chinese readers, and exactly as you see outside the world, do not have in-depth understanding. And when you see Aboriginal writing, Aboriginal writing has to be talking about Aboriginal culture, people, story,
Well,
which is very distinctive from other Australian writers.
I think Aboriginal writing will be distinctive whether the person is addressing stereotypically Aboriginal topics or not, because our view of the world, when we look out, we see through Aboriginal eyes, and so we see things differently to, for example, a German writer or a Chinese writer or a British writer. And the same goes for photography. The Tasmanian Aboriginal photographer Ricky Maynard, I think it was, who said that he can tell by looking at a photograph whether it was an Aboriginal photographer or not. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Which you can relate. You sort of can tell from the writing as well.
Usually, yeah. Because there's some dead giveaways, like the use of we and us as opposed to I and me, you know, the individualistic versus the collective consciousness, and the situating the subject always in place, in country. There is no disembodied individual in Aboriginal writing.
Being an Aboriginal writer, so you always write about Aboriginal life.
I have until now always focused on an Aboriginal story, yes.
Before Too Much Lip, you published Mullumbimby.
Yes.
Which was a big success.
Yes.
But afterwards you feel like the success, you described it as a mainstream success. And you actually wanted to write a different story, a different book, that different from Mullumbimby. You said a book that you want to write, Too Much Lip, is a really hard-nosed book.
Yes.
And frightening to write about. And you set out to write a book that you expect everyone will have a problem with.
Yes.
Including possibly a backlash from the Aboriginal community. So when Too Much Lip is published, it has been praised as a fearless, gritty, unflinching, tough, but also warm and hilariously funny. So it won the highest literary award in Australia, the Miles Franklin Award for 2019. And in your own words, you said you received everything from rave reviews to muted approval.
Yes. And
though you'd still be waiting for someone to hit you over the head on the moonlit light. So, question is, what is it so frightening about writing this book?
It's hard to answer that question without spoilers, but I guess I talk about the Aboriginal community, warts and all. I think a lot of the time my mainstream audience or my Australian audience and the critics think when I talk about it being a frightening book to write, I think that they believe I'm talking about me being rude about white Australia, but that doesn't frighten me in the slightest. I don't care. You know, we are still hunted like animals in this country by men in four-wheel drives. Every weekend in Australia, there are Aboriginal people running for their lives, not in big numbers, but, you know, here and there, a few people will be chased by men who want to harm them and sometimes kill them. So I don't care if white people think I'm being rude about racism in Australia, endemic racism in Australia. That doesn't frighten me in the slightest to talk about that. The thing I was frightened of is not being skillful enough to write a book that does justice to Aboriginal life and which helps white people to demonise Aboriginal men, because I don't want that to happen. But I do want to talk about the Aboriginal community in all its facets, including the ugly facets.
Why were you so surprised by reception of the book?
It's like I'm walking on air. It's changed. It's a bit like when you first get published with your first novel. It's like, oh wow, I've got a book out there. No one can ever take that away. I'm now officially a writer with a published book, and that gives you a massive boost to your confidence and it changes everything. And that's what the Miles Franklin did for me. Yeah.
So do you feel like this award telling you that you succeeded in telling Aboriginal story without, having Aboriginal men being demonized, or is it still unknown quantity?
It's hard to know that, and I've learned to never underestimate Australian racism, basically. I hope so. The writer is actually dead and the reader will read the book that they want to read. And I always take that into account, which is why writing Aboriginal stories is so complex and why outsiders do it so very badly. Because outsiders don't understand how Australian racism towards Aboriginal people and Aboriginal history works, whereas we do. And so take great exacting care to second guess. It's like a game of chess with a non-Aboriginal reader to say, well, they're going to be thinking this at this point, so I need to come at it from that angle and be very strategic about things and at the same time be funny and write a good story.
Winning the prize definitely is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Alexis Wright rang me the next day and said it took her a year to understand the meaning of winning the Miles Franklin, and she's so right. And I'm really glad she told me that because it underlined for me that it's something I need to grow into.
And about the book, you said on several occasions that through this story you wanted to tell truth to power.
Yes.
And then the story you tell is about intergenerational trauma, family violence within the Aboriginal community. So it is a very confronting story. And in the meantime, it is also a story of a defiance. And defiance that shapes the theme of the story and the characters. And one of the typical examples that I noted is when the whole family forced themselves through the locked gate to the Granny Evers Island to scatter Pop's ashes or to take Pop down to the ancestors.
Yes.
And then Mr. Ken asked, why should we have to sneak onto our own land? So that defiance is also shown by you as the author, who, do not shy away from the brutality of a truth.
Yes.
And you're describing violence and trauma in an unflinching manner. You tell the original story from within. So, as you just mentioned, so as not to leave it to outsiders to speculate or formulate to suit to their own agenda. So perhaps you can touch a bit more on why it is so important to tell an Aboriginal story as an insider, and what is the message do you want to convey to the mainstream Australia?
Well, to take the second part of that first, I've never written a book until this book where a major Aboriginal character dies. My single focus for my earlier books has been, we are a living culture. We have not died. We have not become extinct. We exist in every part of Australia. And even though we don't look or sound or think the way you think Aboriginal people should, that doesn't mean that we aren't here and going about our Aboriginal lives. That has always been my main thrust. Since writing Mullumbimby, or about the time I wrote Mullumbimby, I became a little bit more sophisticated in what I was trying to achieve, and I decided that I want my Aboriginal characters to have 4 things. I want them to have beauty, I want them to have power, I want them to have humour, and I want them to have land, because those are the ingredients of a good life. And lately I've just added love to that. Okay, so beauty, power, humour, land and love. Because all of those things are what we had before the white man came to this country. We had rich and satisfying lives. So that's what I want my readers to take away, to understand our humanity.
Why is it so important to tell Aboriginal story as an insider?
Because every story is a political story, and every story that a white writer writes about us has the capacity to do damage to us. White writers can't write Aboriginal stories. They can only write faux Aboriginal stories. They can only write what they believe an Aboriginal story is from a lifetime of racist conditioning in a country that has never bothered to understand us. I'm all for collaboration between Aboriginal writers and other writers, but what I say to outsider writers is, yes, include us in your story, but not as major characters. Only use Aboriginal characters as a minor voice in your piece, because you will not get it right and you will do damage in the process of getting it wrong.
The next question is about the story, and which is Aboriginal life in contemporary Australia. The book, you said, is to portray the Australian underclass in rural New South Wales, especially the Aboriginal underclass.
Yes.
What strikes me the most when reading the book is how close and contemporary these Aboriginal characters feel to readers. While their life is very much regional and local with unique Aboriginal characteristics, the characters themselves are not placed in a remote, isolated or mythical environment. They live very much in the modern society of 2018, just as everyone else does. So, yet, beneath this reality of ordinariness, there is a sharp clash or incongruity between the contemporary society they live in and then the ancient entitlement to their lands that they have continued fighting for. So does this sense of incongruity define or underpin the Aboriginal condition? And is it the theme of the book?
I think it does underpin the Aboriginal condition. It's one of the themes of the book. The American novelist Jane Smiley said something that has always stayed with me, which is that the premise of a novel is always that things are not what they seem. And with Aboriginal society, things are definitely not what they seem, because we have, culturally, there are hidden layers of knowledge and hidden layers of meaning and metaphor everywhere you look, all the time. That's intrinsic to Aboriginal culture. And to come into your full adulthood as an Aboriginal person is to learn and understand a gradual uncovering of those layers of knowledge. Yeah. And as I was saying to you before, in this book, there are elements that only a Bundjalung Aboriginal person will get. There are layers that Aboriginal people will get, and then there are layers that Australians will get, and then there are layers that a general audience will get. So when Ken, the older brother, refuses to tattoo his son Donnie with a hoop pine and says he's not ready for that yet, your Australian reader will think, oh, he's talking about the pain of the tattoo, but an Aboriginal reader will think there's more going on, and a Bundjalung reader will understand what's going on.
That's really interesting. So your book is really depends on the reader.
Yes.
Who reads it, and so what level of a story they will get, or what level of a meaning they will get.
And that's a traditional Aboriginal practice. It's also mirrored in European writing to an extent. For example, Aboriginal folk tales that Europeans have reproduced and understand to be Aboriginal stories for children. They think they are stories for children because that's the only level they've been exposed to. But those stories may have 3 or 4 or even 7 levels of meaning that can be revealed. But the mainstream Australian
may not get it.
Well, they're not exposed to it. They're not told it. They're not taught the language of the story. They're only treated like children because that's how they deserve to be treated.
Do you write this version of a modern Aboriginal life, which we just touch on, to counter the myth that Aboriginal people is a dying race?
Yes.
So you want them to live in the modern world and say, everyone can relate to them to the point that they are there.
Well, all Aboriginal people live in the modern world to some extent. There are quite a few Aboriginal people who speak poor English or sometimes no English, but they're very much in the minority. Most of us speak English as a first language. Most of us live in cities. We all use modern technology to some extent. And we are still Aboriginal and we still practice our culture and keep Aboriginal values, usually.
And then come to the intergenerational violence and racial violence and historical genocide. All these are quite horrendous. And make the reading quite intense.
Yeah.
But they also, in the meantime, all very intertwined, interwoven. Blood will have a blood. It is the oldest law. Thus, the debt is paid. So the question is, has the debt been truly paid and can be paid?
In Australia or in the book?
In the book.
Yes, on a technicality. And there I'm reflecting on The Merchant of Venice.
Yeah. How about in Australia? Can the debt be paid?
Oh, it can be, but it will take time. A crime scene. All of Australia is a crime scene. And the white people are blundering around like people rushing into a crime scene and buggering everything up. So the detective work can't be undertaken. The treaty will be a good start to bring the country together. But the racism is a real obstacle because this persistent idea that Aboriginal people don't have a civilization and a very complex, developed understanding of the universe, not just of the country, but of the universe. There's so much that isn't understood. It's difficult to convey how big the gulf in understanding is. But yeah, the debt can be paid, and debts will hang around one way or another until they are paid. It's just the way of the world. Because
we talk about intergenerational trauma and violence, and in your book, and there is quite the younger generation, they are there, and the younger generation, they are already traumatized by violence,
yes,
and alcohol abuse. So do you think the redemption is possible?
Yeah, because not every Aboriginal family is like this. There's a lot of families where there isn't this degree of violence, and the book is very much about redemption and about healing. We have the tools in our families and in our communities to do the work that needs to be done. Everything in Western psychology, much that is in Western science, much of Western knowledge and lots that lies outside of Western knowledge is in our communities, but because we are seen through a deficit model, it's like, what could those people are useless, those people are drunks, those people are lazy, those people have no capacity, and so we get these incredibly harmful ideas about us that prevent us from healing our own lives. We want to run our own affairs and have the power to do that, and we have the capacity to do it. We did it for 60,000 years or 100,000 years, but it's a long way before we can get other Australians to understand that. I think with the fires that have just happened, the catastrophic fires on the East Coast, there's a glimmer of understanding that Aboriginal people manage this continent with fire. When an Aboriginal fire burn happens, it happens very, very differently to a wildfire. And if you put your hand in the ground when an Aboriginal fire burning has gone through, the ground is not hot. The ground remains lukewarm or cool. And so we have these gifts, but it's like it says in the Christian Bible, don't throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them and then turn around and savage you. That's the end of that quote that people forget. We have these gifts of knowledge and wisdom that you can't give to people who aren't ready to receive.
About characters. At the end of the story, Carrie looked for faces in the rising smoke and didn't know who she was anymore. The family had always been proud of their Chinese blood, and Carrie had long assumed a bit of a white convict was floating around somewhere in the family tree. But to descent from the very first land grabbers, the murdering pioneers, will this identity search be a continuous theme in Australian writing?
Well, this is an interesting question, because what happened in 1988 was Sister Sally Morgan over in Western Australia published her story My Place, which is a story of someone similar to myself who grew up not knowing that she was Aboriginal, coming to understand that she was Aboriginal, and that journey. Ever since then, mainstream Australia tends to read every Aboriginal book through that lens. Now, the only identity confusion in this book is where Kerry learns that they are related to certain white people of the town. And the characters, there's one family who are not the main family who discover an Aboriginal heritage. Apart from that, there is no identity confusion in this book. But outside readers come to Aboriginal text expecting to read the Sally Morgan story. And so that's very often what they will impose. I was told that some reader reflected upon Mullumbimby as a story of someone looking for her identity. It absolutely isn't. The main character in Mullumbimby, she knows she's Aboriginal, she speaks some of her language, she has no confusion whatsoever about being Bundjalung. But that's what outside readers expect, and so that's what they will project onto the story. Identity will always be a central component of my writing and of a lot of Aboriginal writing, because that's the legacy of the genocidal policies. However, it's important not to see an identity struggle where one actually doesn't exist. Kerry knows who she is. Ken knows who he is. Black Superman knows who he is. Pretty Mary knows who she is. Granny Ava definitely knew who she was. Granddad Chinky Joe knew who he was. Pop struggles with identity, and that's not a coincidence that he's the one that's so violent.
What about Donna?
But even Donna is doing it knowingly. You know, she made a choice.
It's about the language of this book, Black and the Blackfellow Humour. The book, as the critics have commented, is gritty but also hilariously funny, which I found I often laugh and cry.
That's good.
Black humour and the blackfellas humour dominate the tone of the story and make the reading engaging, but also quite intense because there is a sharp edge to your humour. Joke is used as a defensive mechanism. Sometimes, as Kerry says, the only safe way was to make a joke of it. Can you tell us why the use of a black and a black fella's humour is so important in this book?
Well, it goes to the authenticity of the book and the portrayal of an Aboriginal family. I think probably other Australians think we sit around being miserable or drunk or whatever, but there's a lot more laughter in Aboriginal lives than any other lives I've observed. You know, we've got 100,000 years of social observation to draw on, and people can be mercilessly funny sometimes.
Is that the funny is a kind of a demonstration of a defiance?
Yeah. And particularly with poor Aboriginal people, not all Aboriginal people are poor, but a lot of us are. And when you've got poor people, they have nothing to lose. And when you've got nothing to lose, you can be as cutting and funny as you like. I'm sure you're familiar with that from Chinese culture as well. You know, the mockery of those that are on the bottom rung.
Other question I really am interested in the title.
Yes.
Too much lip. The beginning of the story, Auntie Mary said about Kerry, too much lip, this little Jing. And close to the end of the story, there is also comment on Kerry, too much lip, her older problem way back. And the older she got, the harder it seemed to get to swallow her opinions. It's like having too much lip is seen as a problem or causing trouble. Can we see that the title has a double meaning? One refers to Kerry, who brings up issues and secrets or hidden away in the past about being loud with her views and thoughts. The other refers to the author, you, who decides not to swallow her opinions and observations.
Yes.
In your, portrayal of Aboriginal life.
There's those two meanings, and then there's a third meaning, which, I'm an Aboriginal author writing mostly to a non-Aboriginal audience. Australia is an adolescent country. Australia has not yet matured into a fully adult society, in my view, and it's the condition of the adolescent to be angry and petulant and to protest. And I knew that title would resonate with mainstream Australia. It's a quote from a friend of mine who's an elder from Cape York, and years and years ago I was telling him about me being cheeky to some authority. I don't know what it was, I can't remember. And he said, in an admiring way, he said, "Oh, too much lip this gin." And it was like a compliment. Yes, talk back. Don't be quiet.
Last question. It's really to Chinese readers. And you know this book is going to be translated into Chinese and to introduce you and your writing.
Yes, this book is Hong Hao. Hong Hao, this book.
What do you sort of expect Chinese readers to get from this book?
I just hope they understand that we are still here, we are modern and ancient at the same time, which I think is probably true for a lot of Chinese people. You know, you have your modern life, but you have your roots that go far, far back in time. And those roots are always important and always present in your modern life.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for your precious time and then wonderful answers. It's
really
good.